Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kelsie. I'm a dietitian at JTA Wellness. A little bit about me, I got my master's in nutrition and I have a little bit of background in cancer research. Today, thank you so much for having me, Thrive Well. Today I'll be going over a little bit about your blood work and the numbers behind that. So knowing what these numbers are and what we can do to move these numbers. I'm going to get into a few things that we're going to go over today. So number one, we're going to talk a little bit about the lipid panel. This involves 4 lipids. So pretty much a lipid is another way of saying a fatty substance in the blood. If we have any nurses here, maybe you might know of this. If not, it's okay. You might have heard from your doctor a little bit about it too. Doctors like to briefly touch on some of these topics, but yeah, cholesterol, HDL, LDL, and triglycerides. We'll talk about what those are and how your diet and lifestyle can kind of move these numbers within your blood work. Secondly, we'll talk about the metabolic panel, which is really we're concerned about glucose. Now, there's a lot of other, entities we'll be looking at or doctors look at within the metabolic panel. So you may have heard of the comprehensive metabolic panel. And that's when, the health professionals, the doctors may look at your electrolytes or your vitamins, such as like vitamin D, vitamin B12. Sometimes doctors will do the comprehensive metabolic panel, or you would also find out more about your liver functioning, your kidney functioning, things of that nature. Third, we'll talk a little bit about vitals, your blood pressure, and what diet and lifestyle can do to help move your blood pressure numbers. Now, the fourth thing we will go over is measurements. So height and weight, and you see WC, that stands for waist circumference, and then BMI, that's your height and weight. And we'll talk a little bit about all of this and what we could do. So why is this important? Well, pretty much these numbers do indicate risk for diseases, but also a lot of these numbers are related to kind of what we do with our diet and our lifestyle. We're going to talk first about lipids. And of course, if you have any questions, I can briefly, stop and, answer any questions, or we could save some towards the end as well. So lipids, like I said, they are a fatty substance in the bloodstream and they move around. One of the things we will talk about is cholesterol. So cholesterol is a waxy substance in the bloodstream. And we actually need cholesterol to build our cells. But sometimes when it is in excess, it becomes a problem and it gives us that risk factor. So there are 2 types of cholesterol sources. There's multiple types of cholesterol, but there's 2 sources of cholesterol, one of them being the liver. Our liver actually makes cholesterol. The second source that cholesterol comes from would be from animal-based sources. And that's because just like we make cholesterol, so do the animals as well. All right. And like I said, there's 2 types of cholesterol that we're really concerned with when it comes to your blood work. And that would be, who can guess? If you've ever seen it, HDL and LDL. And if you've ever been curious, like, what does that mean? What do these mean? Well, I can tell you a little bit about it. So LDL, let's start with one of them. LDL, we kind of see it as the bad cholesterol. Doctors will say, you need to find ways to lower this. You need to do this and do that. So you'll probably see if it is higher in your blood work, then that just means we could do a little bit. It's an opportunity to do some things to lower it. So we kind of consider it the lousy cholesterol. And L for LDL, L for lousy or lame. Now it stands for low density lipoprotein, but you don't really need to know that. You just need to know that it's the bad one. Secondly, the HDL. So just the opposite of LDL. HDL is the good cholesterol. So we kind of see it as the healthy one that we want to boost. We want to increase the HDL, and it stands for high density lipoprotein. So healthy, happy, H for HDL and H for happy. And so along with other substances, excess cholesterol can form thick deposits in our arteries and narrow our arteries. If you've ever heard of the term atherosclerosis, that's the narrowing of the arteries, and it can lead to potential complications like stroke or heart attack. And that's why doctors really want us to move those numbers. Now, here's a visual graphic of HDL and LDL. It's kind of funny. Think of LDL right here. This one is the bad roommate. So this is the bad roommate. It's like the family member or the roommate that just kind of leaves things around, leaves a mess, and doesn't really pick up after themselves. So HDL, that's the happy, healthy, cholesterol. That's the good roommate, picking up after everyone, kind of cleans things up. And that's exactly what these cholesterols do. If you're thinking about it, analogies are a good way to make sense of nutrition and science. Any questions so far? All right. We can also look at triglycerides. So triglycerides are a little bit different, but still they're a lipid. But they're a type of fat found in our blood. And the way that this happens is if we eat a little too much calories from our food and we don't immediately burn those calories or use those calories, it will transform into triglycerides, which then turns into fat cells, which is the storage form of energy. And that's how triglycerides are happening. So it contributes to that word again, arteriosclerosis or atherosclerosis, and it increases your risk for those complications like stroke or heart attack. And that's another reason why doctors look for that in our blood. Now, you may be curious, like, how does this form in our bloodstream and how does it create that narrowing of the arteries? Well, here's a little breakdown. So you have your artery and some plaque, and it's forming and it's kind of building up. And then it can cause damage to the lining of the artery. Then plaque grows more and more, and over time, we see some more damage. This could rupture, this could cause blood clots. And again, it can also limit blood flow. So that's when we see that heart attack risk, that stroke risk. But we can do some things about it. And the number one step is knowing where your numbers are. And to know, the good news is it's not always going to be the same if you can make some changes here and there. But first, let's talk about, what are those numbers to shoot for? So total cholesterol, we like to see that a little bit lower than 200. And if it is above 200, that's when you will see that risk for those cardiovascular complications. We see CVD, that's abbreviated for cardiovascular disease. Good job. All right. Yeah, so that's what CVD means, cardiovascular disease. Just think of this as like heart disease, those complications that we're referring to. So LDL, the bad roommate, the bad cholesterol, we want it lower. We want it lower than 100 because if it's above 100, that's when we see that risk. HDL, we want it actually higher. So for women, we would like to see it higher than 50. For men, above 40. So if it's a little bit lower, your doctor will probably tell you, hey, blood work is showing this. And the good news is we can do a few things with our diet and lifestyle to move these numbers. So first, knowing what these numbers are, and then knowing in the next few slides, I'll let you know what we could do to move these numbers. Triglycerides, we would like to see triglycerides a little bit lower than 150. This one's a little bit different because it can contribute to other diseases like type 2 diabetes, glucose intolerance, insulin resistance, if you've heard any of those terms, as well as heart disease. Any questions so far? All right. Now, here's a little bit more, if you want to get more specific, you can ask your doctor to help you out. But this calculation is pretty much just to see another way of indicating risk of cardiovascular disease. So you could look at your HDL and total cholesterol ratio. So you could divide HDL by total cholesterol, and this is the number, the normal number, so 24% or above. And then just like that, so triglycerides divided by HDL, then we would want 2%. All right. And if you have any, if you want me to slow down, I can, but we can move on to the next slide. So here's when it gets really related to nutrition and lifestyle. You see there's a red and then there's a green. So if you're looking at LDL, the bad cholesterol, and then the good cholesterol, there's a few things we can do. So saturated fat. Let's first talk about what saturated fat is. If you've ever seen bacon grease get solid at room temperature, that's saturated fat right there. Because of the way the chemical bonds are made, it makes it, more prone to being solid. Same thing with any kind of grease from Tupperwares after, meat has been sitting in it, things like that. Trans fat, we don't really have many products on the market that have trans fat because it's actually, to my knowledge, been banned. But there are sometimes those few occasions when processed foods may have fats and oils transform into trans fat. Keyword trans. So when we have an excess or increased intake of saturated fat or trans fat, we are contributing to increasing our LDL. So, and lowering our HDL if we have too much trans fat. So we would want to limit foods that have saturated fat and trans fat. Now, speaking of the good cholesterol, HDL, and good fats, we can increase the HDL cholesterol with exercise or eating foods that have monounsaturated fats. So if we are low in consumption of monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and if we're not exercising, we are not doing anything to help lower that LDL. But if we have an emphasis on these in our diet and lifestyle, we can lower LDL. So here's a little bit of a picture to kind of show you. If you're likely eating foods that have a little bit more of these in your diet, so avocados, olive oil, nuts, seeds, fish, like fatty fish, and that's when you'll see, even legumes, you'll see, these numbers are likely to change. And then we would want to limit fast food. So fried foods, chips, yeah. And so that's just kind of what we'll talk about going forward. A few slides from now, you'll see this trend. So speaking of cholesterol and nutrition, there's a few redundancies you'll see, but eating less saturated fat, like I said. But if we're kind of being a little bit more specific and we're looking really closely at what we're eating, we really want to dial down on how much of the red meat we eat, fatty cuts of meat especially, butter, poultry with skin. So nothing wrong with poultry, but the skin is where that fat is. That's why a lot of people like the skin, because the fat is in it, and that's what makes it so flavorful. Full fat dairy products, again, nothing wrong with dairy, but if it's a full fat dairy product, that's when we see a lot more of that saturated fat. So that's why a lot of people are advised to, eat a little bit or choose low fat dairy options. Again, with the fried foods, you'll see a lot of saturated fat with fried foods, so it's good to limit how much you eat of that, as well as lard and shortening, which are a lot of ingredients in a lot of foods. All right, and now trans fat. So we're kind of curious, where's that coming from? It's a little sneaky. There's this term, partially hydrogenated oils. This can happen in any process of a processed food. but specifically even supplements too. So like some oil-based supplements, you know, depending on the storage, the manufacturing, the transportation, there could be exposure to different temperatures like heat, and that might even change the structure of oils. For example, and you can even look for partially hydrogenated oils in the ingredients label sometimes. But specifically, most people don't really know this, but sometimes at high smoke points, olive oil can even turn into trans fat. If it's, you know, overly cooked, then it's turning its structure. But let's talk about some other foods that do, you know, tend to sneak in some trans fat. That would be things like cookies, pastries, some frozen meals, shortening, cookie dough, sometimes dairy or non-dairy creamer, sometimes, stick margarine, and again, fried foods. So you've been seeing fried foods in the naughty list a lot. All right, now these are some of the ones we want to increase in our diet to help move those numbers. So monounsaturated fat, these are a little bit more liquidy at room temperature. Have you ever seen, you know, olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil? They all have more of those healthy fats in them. And along with fish, some nuts, you know, they have these in them. So olive oil, like I said, avocado, even olives, avocados as whole form, nut butters and nuts and seeds. Now, a lot of people think avocado is a veggie. I will say, yeah, I mean, some people call it a fruit too, if you really look into all of that. But I like to see it as a nut because it's very similar in structure as a nut. It's got some fiber and some healthy fats in it, just like nuts and olives. But yeah, it's pretty cool to think about it like that. Polyunsaturated fats are another really healthy fat that you can emphasize in your diet. This would be those omega-3 fatty acids. We need about 1 to 1.6 grams of them a day. And that's why some people take supplements of them. But you can get them from food. So salmon, herring, mackerel, tuna, sardines. And of course, if you're following more plant-based, rather, you would want to go for some seeds, flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp hearts, and then walnuts are really high in them too. Same thing with fortified eggs. You might see this on the label in some of the eggs. But yeah, back to the flax seeds, nuts and seeds in general, but specifically flax seeds, chia, and hemp. They have a real nutty taste and a little bit of a crunchy texture to them. So it's good to get creative. And if you're okay and open to it, you can try adding it to salads or pastas or maybe even smoothies or yogurt. You can even maybe try baking with them if you want. Yeah. Okay, so omega-6 is another version of those polyunsaturated fats. And you can get this from vegetable oils, almonds, other nuts and seeds like peanuts and sunflower seeds. So if you've noticed a trend here, a lot of nuts and seeds and fatty fish. Okay, another one, this one, we didn't get into too much detail, but more fiber. To really make it a shortcut, you would want a lot more plant-based foods like veggies, fruits, and whole grains. So the more fiber, the better. That can also lower your cholesterol. So this is, you know, beans, lentils, legumes, whole grains, oatmeal, fruits, veggies, and nuts. So there's that about cholesterol. We'll talk a little bit more about triglycerides now. So triglycerides, like I said, it's really forming from that excess calorie intake if we're not burning those calories immediately. So we do recommend limiting refined carbs. If you've heard before, refined carbs are a little bit more let's see. So it's a little bit more simple. They're simple carbs, not complex carbs. You've probably heard the difference in the past. Yeah, so refined carbs, they tend to be a little bit more processed. versus their counterpart, which is whole grains, multigrains, wheat products. But yeah, so we would want to limit or dial down on how much we're eating of simple carbs, chips, snack crackers, pastries like cinnamon rolls, honey buns, sugary drinks like sodas, even like sweet tea, candy, and those real sugary those sugary cereals, like the really colorful sugary ones. So yeah, and added sugars tend to increase triglycerides. You would want to choose those healthier fats by, again, kind of limiting those saturated fats, but increasing those unsaturated ones. Overall, it's recommended to reduce your calorie intake and to achieve or maintain your weight, but achieve a healthy weight that's healthy for you. And we'll get into that in a minute. You may hear from your doctor about weight, different strategies to lose weight. There's always going to be a different plan for everyone. It's super individualized, but a lot of research has shown that losing about 5 to 10% of your weight can lower triglycerides. And so in the name of moving those numbers, and just a kind of a recap, extra calories contribute to forming triglycerides, which is cell storage, and then reducing your calorie intake can reduce your triglycerides on your blood work. But if you are really wanting to get down to this, you can always talk about it with a doctor or a health professional like a dietitian, and they can really help you to achieve this in a very feasible, realistic, practical way. Because nutrition can be very individualized, very personalized. Another method to limit or reduce your triglycerides is by limiting alcohol. I see some smiles, some laughs, but yeah, did you know alcohol gives us calories? And it's not just because if there's sugar added, whether there's sugar added or not, alcohol gives us calories, just like carbs, protein, and fats do. Yeah. Anyway, alcohol is very high in calories, like I said, can contribute to your triglycerides. But another thing is not just limiting alcohol, but also just exercising regularly. So a lot of research has been shown that at least 30 minutes of physical activity that's safe for you can really help with moving those triglyceride numbers. So 30 minutes a day at least. I always tell people if you could try breaking it up, if you have to, if you're a busy person, break it up, do maybe 15 minutes and then another 15 minutes later of something, walking. All right, so we're kind of moving over onto another topic now, glucose. And if anyone had any questions, I'll take a moment. No? Okay, so glucose is another term for sugar, but glucose is the fuel that we need. Our bodies need glucose. So think of it as like the gas to our gas tank. We need a certain amount of them each day for our brains to function too. So glucose, again, is the simple form of sugar that circulates our bloodstream to give us that energy, that fuel for our cells. So think of it like this. When you are eating a carbohydrate food, it's going to break down into glucose. Then from your digestive system, that glucose will absorb into your bloodstream. And that's when you have an elevated blood sugar until it gets into those cells for your energy. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's got a purpose. So we want adequate levels of glucose. We don't want low glucose in our blood, but we also don't want too high of blood glucose either. And it's natural, it's common, and even if you have risk for diabetes, prediabetes, you'll be seeing some higher levels of blood glucose. But sometimes this is not just from our control. Sometimes it can happen from stress, from lack of sleep, being sick can make us have high blood sugar. Even medicine, I've seen it from my experience working in a hospital. I've seen a lot of people have high blood sugar solely, main contributor being a steroid, for example. So sometimes it's not always in our control, but we can do the best we can to manage and move those numbers. Did you know that the liver is a busy organ and sometimes will produce that glucose for us to help manage normal levels if we're not eating enough, if we're fasting? So the liver will be like, time to make my own fuel. Yeah. So if you're curious what those normal numbers are, here they are. So fasting blood sugar is a lot of times what you'll get in your blood work. And we want the number to be between 70 to 99. We don't want it below 70. If it's above 99, your doctor might get your blood, sent out for some further testing to then test your A1C, your hemoglobin A1C. So just in case you're curious, 100 to 125 would be that range for categorizing as prediabetes. And then above 126, that would be categorized as diabetes. And then when blood is tested further for hemoglobin A1C, this would be another indicator if you might be in the prediabetes or diabetes range. So 5.7, if it's a little bit lower, you're in the clear. But if it is above 5.7, that's indicating, maybe we need to categorize it. Okay, so if it's 5.7 between there and 6.4, you might be categorized as prediabetes, having prediabetes. And of course, a lot of these numbers can change a lot, whether you're diabetic already or approaching that borderline. I've seen a lot of people get their numbers down with diet and lifestyle. And sometimes medication is another, third way of helping. Any questions so far? But just to kind of touch on this a little bit more, this is more of an average of 3 months. So what you did 4 months ago may not be reflecting. Or if you were being very careful 2 weeks before your blood work, but it's still not where you want it, sometimes it's reflecting of, again, what you did 3 months ago or 2 months ago. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the consequences of diabetes and why we want to prevent those numbers from being too high, because we want to prevent diabetes, or if we have diabetes, we want to manage it the best we can. So some complications would be, to name a few, so strokes, blindness, sometimes heart attacks, kidney dysfunction or kidney disease. Sometimes that may mean a long journey ending up on dialysis, unfortunately. High blood pressure, some dysfunction reproductively, some loss of mobility, and then neuropathy, some nerve damage. But the good news is we can do the best we can with our nutrition to help move those numbers and prevent those complications. So like I said before, there's some complex carbs, but there's also some simple carbs. We kind of touched on a few of that, but to kind of go deeper into it. So simple carbs would be anything that's really quick to go through your digestive system and end up in the bloodstream and spike your blood sugar. So donuts, candy, soda, cookies, fries, even white bread. And that's because white bread is a little bit more refined. It's more processed. So a lot of the fiber has been taken out. Now versus wheat bread, it has a little bit more fiber. So it gives it some complexity to it. And that's what makes it complex carb. Same thing with other things you see here. They're fruits and veggies. They have fiber and antioxidants and vitamins in them. So they're a little bit more complex. You see, this is probably either a bowl of brown rice or oatmeal, and that would be another complex carb. Sweet potato is actually considered one too, because it's a whole food. Yeah.
What's that at the right, the top row on the right? next to the broccoli, or
Are you pointing to this? Yeah. It looks like it's probably whole wheat pasta.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you are curious, wheat is mentioned a lot with complex carbs because it's got a little bit more of that wholeness. It's not a refined carb. It's still got that wheat and germ. So it's not as refined. Yeah, it's a whole wheat, a whole grain. But a lot of other whole grains that I do really, I'm a big fan of quinoa, buckwheat, barley, farro, amaranth. Oh, I could go on and on, but those are all really complex carbs that you can definitely add. Even beans too, they have some fiber. Yeah. Um, so we want to manage our carbs the best we can to prevent or manage diabetes. So eating more complex fiber-rich carbs. Um, yeah, and then eating fewer of those simple carbs. And of course, it's not always going to be about the type of carbs. Sometimes it's about the amount. So portioning control, figuring out with a dietitian or a health professional how much carbs are needed at a time for you individually. So it's going to be different for everyone. But again, you may want some help to really get to the bottom of it, and that's why we talk a lot about quantity at a time and portion control. Another thing is actually pairing carbs with something else like protein and fat. So like I mentioned earlier, some nuts, avocados, good sources of fats, those would be some good ones to pair up with your carbs. That's why you might hear a lot of times avocado toast is a great healthy choice in that regard. Protein with carbs, so that's why you might hear like, oh, maybe have some nuts with your fruit to really slow down that digestion. If you slow down digestion, you're able to manage your blood sugar just because you're preventing that rapid intake, rapid absorption of that sugar to your blood. Yeah, so think of it like buddies, like a buddy system. Carbs want their friends with them, protein and fat. And you mentioned earlier macros. These are those macros that we're referring to. When you hear energy needs, eat within your energy needs. So energy, another way of saying calorie, because calories are the units of energy. So we kind of just, another way of saying we want to eat within our calorie range. We don't want to undereat, but we also don't want to overeat, right? And then, of course, if you're curious, you can talk with a health professional about what that looks like for you. Exercising regularly, whatever's safe for you and enjoyable. It could be different every day. It doesn't have to be the same, but exercise really does help manage blood sugar. It's kind of like a long story, but short, like everything in a nutshell. Exercise, contracting your muscles can actually help get blood sugar out of the blood and into the cells. There's a whole scientific mechanism behind that. So that's why a lot of recommendations out there are saying to exercise regularly. And of course, like I said, stress does increase blood sugar. It may even be at that point, it doesn't matter what you're eating or how you're eating. Sometimes stress definitely does have a big impact on our blood sugar. So finding different ways that work for you to relax your nervous system. Here is a graphic to show how different foods can be influences of our blood sugar. So refined simple carbs, they kind of give us that quick energy boost and then they die out, they burn out. Over time, we can see a little bit of a gradual increase in our blood sugar with when we have complex carbs with our protein foods. And then dependent on other types of foods that we're eating with it. And it also depends on the timing as well. So it's just another way of saying that it really matters, like the amount and the type and what you're pairing up with. Yeah. So any questions so far before we get into blood pressure? Okay. So blood pressure, is definitely something that a lot of doctors look at. And it's important because that's a big indicator of our heart health. So we want our numbers a little bit lower than 120 or 80. And if they're above that number, that is indicating risk for heart disease. Here's a little bit of a breakdown. So this is normal, this is elevated, and these are the two high stages. When we're in the orange and red, that's when a lot of times the doctors will start having conversations with people to really buckle down, or medicine may be needed to start helping out with lowering or moving those numbers. So if anything, you might be curious what those numbers are, what they mean really. So systolic pressure, that's the number at the top. So the number at the top, that's the pressure against your artery walls when your heart is contracting. And then diastolic, the lower number, is actually the number, it's the pressure against your artery walls when your heart is relaxed. So that's why you see those numbers there. So again, systolic, diastolic. Yeah. Okay. So there are, again, why is this important? So there are some consequences with high blood pressure. Some of them are very similar to blood sugar. When we can't manage our blood sugar or our blood pressure, some of them are very similar. So kidney disease, heart attacks, heart failure, some vision loss, stroke, sexual dysfunction. And that's why it's important. But what we can do about it, the best we can, and it might sound redundant, what we can do to prevent blood pressure or complications from high blood pressure would be the same recommendations we have for, preventing diabetes too. So eating complex carbs, having lean meats. So the cooking method of our meats matters, but also the choice of meat. So round cuts and loins are a little bit leaner. The breast of chicken is a little bit leaner than thighs. Of course, any meat grilled or baked, roasted rather than fried, because fried adds that extra amount of fat to it. And speaking of fats, we want those healthy fats, those heart healthy fats that I mentioned earlier. Those unsaturated, those polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats. Higher potassium, so sometimes increasing your intake of potassium foods coming from fruits and veggies, like oranges, bananas, the skin from potatoes, tomatoes. But of course, it's very individualized. Some people may need to not increase their potassium if they've got another condition, such as kidney disease. But again, that's when we have a conversation with the doctor. Lowering sodium is a big help with lowering blood pressure. And so we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's very interesting. Managing stress can help, and then drinking less alcohol can also help. So very redundant with blood sugar too. Eating within those calorie needs. And so about sodium, when we say reduce sodium intake, we don't just mean reducing the table salt, because believe it or not, only 25% of sodium in our diet really even comes from table salt, because 75% of it comes from processed foods, like breads, cheese, lunch meats, pizza, soups. And of course, there's always going to be a lower, there's going to be an alternative. So let's say you want some green beans, but you want a lower sodium green bean, you can find that on the market. Same thing with soup, you can find some lower, some reduced sodium soup. But if you're ever wondering like how much is in other foods like processed meats, like sausages, I've seen some as high as 700 milligrams, even 1,000 milligrams. And most of the time we're really aiming for less than 1,500 if we have a disease. But for the general population, I would say 2,000 milligrams per day. And this is in a day. To give it a little perspective, 1 teaspoon of salt equates to 2,000 milligrams of sodium. So just one little teaspoon can make a big difference. Yeah. Um, but like I said, there's so many options out there and so many alternatives. Any questions? And of course, these are processed foods. So you can make healthier versions of pizza. You can make healthier soups. You can go for some cheeses. A variety is going to be key. Some of them are going to be higher than other types of cheeses. So it really just, if you're wanting to really talk about it, a dietitian can definitely help. Or any of your health professionals would probably be really willing to help too. But yeah, we're going to go move on to measurements. Yeah, so if you've heard of BMI, it's really a calculation using your height and your weight to determine where you fall into the category of BMI. And a lot of times our health system is, built on these indicators, as we mentioned before, the blood work. And so this is just one of them without using blood work. But of course, BMI, I don't want you to think in the black and white. Sometimes there's gray, some nuance. So for example, if you were, there was a study done that looked at football players, and they happened to all be falling in the BMI above overweight, obese category because of their height and their weight, even though they're super athletic. So I just want you to know that there's so much that we actually need to look into further than just looking at BMI only. And weight on the scale doesn't always indicate your health. We want to look at other things like your muscle mass, your bone density, your fat percentage, things like that, your water weight. But yeah, of course, BMI, this is the normal range that health professionals look at. And if it's under 18.5, a lot of times that's considered underweight. If it is above 24.9, that would be then overweight or obese. Waist circumference is a good extra measurement to look at to indicate maybe fat percentage or how much fat we have. And we'll look at that in a minute too. But we do recommend waist circumference to be under 35 for women and under 40 for men. But of course, everyone could be very different. But we do see that a lower waist circumference is associated with lower or high waist circumference is associated with increased risk for CVD, cardiovascular disease, glucose intolerance, diabetes, insulin resistance. But here's that chart. Just know this was all made up by a mathematician, so it's all numbers. The healthy BMI over here, overweight, and then obese. Yeah. And then just a little touch on waist circumference. So here is a healthy weight using waist circumference and looking at fat. So there's two types of fat that we're kind of looking at here. So subcutaneous, that's under the skin, but then there's visceral fat, which is a little bit deeper in there, covering those organs. And yes, there's a protective component to that, but also we do want a little bit lower visceral fat, just because it's associated with inflammation, which is associated with a lot of diseases. But yeah, I know I said that there were a lot of recommendations for diet and lifestyle that overlapped for helping move those numbers and preventing those risks for heart disease, diabetes. And so some of those are also redundant with preventing cancer as well. So this is these are some recommendations, diet and lifestyle recommendations formulated by American Institute for Cancer Research. A lot of them are very much so saying the same exact thing. So lower your sugar intake from sugary beverages and sweets, limit your alcohol consumption, limit your fast food consumption, your red meat consumption, because those are where those high amounts of saturated fats are. Eat a diet with more whole grains, fruits, veggies, legumes, because that's where all those complex carbs are. Being physically active and then being a healthy weight for you. Yeah, any questions? This is our team, JTA Wellness. We have 9 dietitians right now. Um, but yeah, you can always schedule an appointment if you're curious. Um, but yeah, what kind of questions do y'all have?
That's a very good slide.
Yeah, that's why I went back to it. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here with Thrive Well. I'm really happy to be here, and y'all were a great audience.